The boss told me to step aside, and the words hit like a brick. I stood frozen in the glass office while he read a single line from a letter. "We are reorganizing, your role is no longer needed." 15 years. 15 years of mornings, deadlines, nights, and small victories reduced to a polite sentence. I tried to speak, but my voice cracked. He did not look at me. He folded the paper like he was closing a file on my life. Behind him, the city shimmered, unaware. I could see the spreadsheet on his screen that I had built, numbers I had watched and shaped. Then a colleague burst in with wild eyes and whispered, "The fund, 2.1 billion gone. Overnight." Time stopped. My chest hurts. The wall clock sounded wrong. My hands shook so hard I couldn't hold my coffee. 15 years of loyalty, and now my title evaporated while billions vanished. I felt betrayed, small, and absurdly exposed. I wanted to scream at him, at the company, at the world that trusted spreadsheets more than people. Instead I gathered my bag, my badge, and my dignity, which felt like a paperweight, and walked out while the floor beneath me seemed to twitch. Outside, the air felt thin. Cars flowed by like a river I could not join. I called my sister but she didn't pick up. My mind replayed every late night, every crisis I had solved, every time I covered for someone. The $2.1 billion vanished, but so did the faces that used to smile at me in meetings. People who once thanked me now walked past. A security guard offered a tight nod like he had been warned not to speak. I tried to make sense of the timeline. The transfer had cleared at 1 in the morning, he had said. I had left at 9 the night before. That left a long dark stretch where anything could have happened. I felt small and urgent. I thought of the spreadsheet's last save, the backup servers, the audit trail I had written into protocol out of habit. Could someone erase it? Could someone hide it? My mind jumped to names and motives immediately. Anger warmed under the shock, sharp and bright. I wanted to go back in, to force my way into servers and logs, but my badge no longer opened doors. The building felt like a locked chest with its key thrown away. That night I sat in my small kitchen and stared at the blank wall. I had no plan, just a hunger for answers that kept me awake. I dug out my old notebooks. I tracked dates and times like a detective making a timeline. The transfer log showed a single approval token from an account labeled Executive Reserves. It matched the man who told me to step aside. My hands trembled as I circled entries. I wrote questions in big letters. Who gained? Who lost? What did I lose besides my job? My apartment felt too quiet for the size of my thoughts. I found a snapshot of a meeting email chain with my name on it, praising my analysis for the reserve strategy. I felt cheated by the memory of praise. A neighbor knocked and borrowed sugar, oblivious. I lied and said I had plenty. Later, I logged into my old home server backup to check files I had pulled when I suspected risk months ago. The backups were intact, but the connection logs were scrubbed clean after 1 in the morning. Someone had removed traces. I felt hunted. At 3 a.m., I noticed a missed call from an unknown number. A single message, "Don't go looking." My throat closed. The hunt felt bigger than me. I went back the next day with a borrowed press pass from a friend who still worked there. The security guard at the lobby scanned the fake pass and hesitated. He knew me. He asked, "You really want to come in?" I pressed my smile and said yes. The elevator doors closed with the same soft thud. The office smelled of lemon cleaner and stale coffee. People moved with a strange hush. I reached my old desk and found a sticky note. Sorry. No name. My computer was turned off. I used my old credentials and they worked for a moment, then locked me out after a failed admin check. I slipped into the server room pretending to be maintenance. The racks hummed like a sleeping hive. My hand skimmed the labels until I found the log server. I copied what I could on a tiny drive I kept for emergencies. The logs showed multiple access attempts from an external IP and then a local override from an executive terminal at 1:13. The override came from the boss's user. A new layer of betrayal set in. I felt like someone had cut the thread of my life while I slept. I left before anyone noticed me sweating under fluorescent light, clutching a drive that smelled like ozone and secret. A week later, The news spun its own story. Headlines said a security breach had stolen funds overnight. The company blamed malware and outside hackers. My name didn't appear. The board announced investigations and a pause on bonuses. Share prices trembled. Investors demanded answers. I watched interviews where executives spoke in smooth words that did not line up with the logs I had seen. They smiled and said unfortunate like it was weather. I kept digging. The copied logs revealed a pattern, deliberate internal masking, timestamps altered to hide hands. Someone had the skill and the inside access to rewrite history. I sent an anonymous tip to a journalist who had covered my company before. I didn't want my name attached. Exposure could be dangerous. The reporter called back with a meeting request at a diner. I met him late, slid the drive across, and watched him swallow. He asked why I had stayed silent for a week. My answer bubbled: fear, disbelief, and a hope that the company would do right. He promised to look. He asked about the motive. I said simply, the truth. He left with a nod heavier than his coat. I felt less alone, but the path ahead looked darker and steeper. The next morning my mailbox had a plain envelope. Inside was an old photograph of me at a company picnic, smiling with cake frosting on my cheek. On the back, written in block letters, stop. No name, no return address. My pulse thudded. I knew this was not a simple warning. Someone had access to company archives or social media. I took the photo to a friend who worked in archives and asked quietly if anyone had printed it recently. She squinted and said she hadn't seen physical copies in years. Someone had reached into a folder that only a few touched. The journalist called with a cryptic update. His sources were scared. The story was getting buried in legal threats. He said he had a lead on a shell company tied to a trust in a different country, but he needed proof. I realized I needed more than logs. I needed someone with legal teeth. I reached out to a lawyer I barely knew from a previous contract. She met me in a parking garage, all brisk and sharp. She said she could subpoena records, but it would take time and make me visible. I hesitated. The photograph under my hand felt like a bell that could not be unrung. My lawyer, Mara, dug in. She had a steady face that made me trust the plan. She filed motions and asked for emergency injunctions to freeze any transfers to the shell accounts. The judge granted temporary holds. For a few hours, I tasted relief. Then the judge's clerk called Mara with confusion. The paperwork showed a revised signature time that put the transfers through before the injunction. Someone had backdated approvals in a different system. The web of fraud was smarter than we were. Mara looked at me and said, "They covered their tracks better than we thought." My anger rose like a wave. I asked if the boss could be held accountable. She paused. Proving his intent is hard when the paper trail points elsewhere. The company announced a special committee to review leadership decisions. It felt like a theater. I started to suspect that more than one executive was involved. Each night, I replayed the boss's calm face, the letter telling me to step aside, and the way his finger tapped his desk like punctuation. A new thought landed. What if I hadn't been removed to hide incompetence, but to silence someone who might have noticed? Fear and clarity braided together into purpose. I started my own quiet investigation. I made a list of people with access: board members, CFOs, IT heads. I drew lines between names and companies. I learned to read public filings for hidden signals. One name kept popping up, someone who sat on multiple boards and had a pattern of moving money through shadow accounts. He was careful, polite in public, ruthless in private. I found that he had ties to property purchases the week before the transfer. The pattern smelled like greed. I visited one of the properties and met a neighbor who remembered a man in a dark coat arriving late at night. The neighbor offered gossip, not proof. Still, gossip can be fuel. The journalist pushed harder, and his article dropped a hint about the board member's offshore trust. The company pushed back with a lawyerly letter calling the article reckless. My inbox is filled with thinly veiled threats. Sleep shrank to 4-hour pockets. I found myself watching the boss's movements through public calendars and event photos. He attended a gala the night after the transfer and smiled in every photo. The world seemed to prefer sparkle over truth. I felt both tired and furious, like a storm in slow motion. A new twist arrived when the IT head I trusted resigned suddenly and moved to another country within days. His goodbye email was full of platitudes, but his last line read, "For those who care, check the audit archives." I took that as a lifeline. Mara filed for emergency access to those archives. The court allowed a supervised review. When we opened the archives, we found fragments, backup tapes with corrupted headers, notes in code pointing to a cleaner program used to erase traces. One tape included a hidden folder with an encrypted file labeled contingency. Mara brought a cyber expert who worked in short sleeves and coffee stains. He cracked a piece of the code and his eyes went wide. The contingency file was a map of transfers and approvals with a list of key dates and fake memo templates. It read like a playbook for stealing without leaving fingerprints. It named roles, not people. But one line had an odd nickname the boss used in a private chat months ago. Suddenly I felt closer. The world tightened. The boss's letter, my removal, the 113 override, connected. I felt both vindicated and more in danger. The plan to expose them became clearer but also riskier. With more evidence, Mara pushed for depositions. The company delayed, claiming complexity. Then a surprise. An anonymous whistleblower contacted the journalist with recorded calls. The calls were muffled but unmistakable, executives discussing contingency scripts and approvals. The voice of the boss matched the tone I had heard. When the journalist hinted at publishing, the company launched a counterclaim and accused him of fabricating audio. The press turned sour. I watched as public sympathy split like thin ice. My own anonymity kept me safe but also made me feel invisible. One night, I opened a folder I had saved with drafts of presentations I used to make. I found an old email where I had warned about the executive reserve's vulnerability. I had suggested checks and controls. My suggestion had been ignored in favor of speed and profit. Rage burned. I realized my role as a loyal fixer had been used against me. My warnings had been silenced. The whistleblowers' recordings gave us momentum, but the company had lawyers with deep pockets. The board promised reforms. That word tasted cold. I felt like a tiny boat riding a heavy storm, steering toward revelation. Then the twist. The boss was suddenly friendly in public. He gave interviews about lessons learned and called for unity. His charm made people drop their guard. He praised staff like a shepherd who had just survived wolves. Meanwhile, deposits continued into accounts we couldn't touch. Mara said the transfers had moved through a network designed to be untouchable. The whistleblowers' tapes prompted regulators to ask questions, but enforcement moved slowly and politely. The company launched an internal culture initiative. People posted optimistic messages on social feeds. I felt like my grief had been turned into corporate branding. I began to receive small anonymous gifts at my door, a simple black card with 3 numbers printed. I realized it was part of an old encryption code I had used years ago. Someone was playing with me. The numbers matched a server room access log time. Following that lead, I discovered a forgotten cache of backup files stored on an old machine in a decommissioned office the company had not cleared. The files were partial but included an email chain with a conversation about redirecting funds. One name appeared in shorthand. The shorthand belonged to an executive who had been promoted the week after the transfer. The ropes tightened. I felt a fierce hope rise like a new sun. This chapter of the fight turned personal. The boss called me and asked to meet in a neutral cafe. I could have refused, but I went to hear what he would say. He looked tired, not the crisp version I had fired me with. He said, "Sasha, we need everyone to be calm." His words were soft like velvet. I asked him if he had authorized the override. He smiled and said, "I approve of many things. I don't control every line." It felt like a dodge. Then he leaned forward and said, "If you push, people will hurt." He meant me. My fingers found the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. I looked at him hard and said, "I won't be silenced." He shrugged like a man who expected proof would never find him. After the meeting, as I walked back to my car, I felt watched. A sedan followed at a distance. My phone battery drained faster than it should. Fear returned, but with it, a new resolution. I began to photograph everything. Receipts, parking tickets, shadows on building walls. Small things that could pin down time and place. The leader who had tossed me aside believed power could smooth everything. He underestimated the stubbornness that comes from being betrayed. My anger was steady now, not wild. It had a purpose. Someone else made a move. The whistleblower's identity leaked and then disappeared. The journalist's office was broken into, his notes rifled. He called me one night from a payphone, voice trembling. "They're cleaning up," he said. "If this story goes down, it's not an accident." The journalist refused to be cowed and planned one last push with the recorded calls. Mara warned against going public too soon. She wanted legal armor. I argued for urgency. We compromised. We would release a carefully edited dossier to regulators and a trusted news outlet simultaneously. The day we released it, the world tilted. Social feeds lit up with anger. A protest outside the headquarters swelled. Investors demanded emergency meetings. The boss gave a terse statement and retreated to a private flight. The company's stock plunged. For the first time since that morning, I felt the scales tip. Yet, in the chaos, I received a new threat, a text with a photo of my neighbor's child at a playground. "Back off," it read. My stomach dropped. The fight was no longer just about money or reputation. It was about safety. I sat with that weight and decided to move forward anyway. Fear would not be the final author of my story. The regulators opened an investigation. Subpoenas flew like paper birds. The board demanded emergency sessions. The boss returned, thin-faced and apologetic. He played contrition on camera. But behind closed doors, his network worked. Several board members resigned, blame like dry paint flaking off. We found money trails leading to a trust with shell companies and front purchases. They had built a spider web for the cash. Each web strand broke when we pulled at it. A surprise emerged. One of the shell companies had a tie to a charity the boss publicly supported. People felt sick. During a televised hearing, a former CFO testified she had seen memos denying red flags. Her voice was small but true. The boss's calmness cracked in private meetings. Yet the money's path still had gaps. Some transfers had been routed through cryptocurrency mixers and then converted into holdings with anonymous trustees. The law could take time to unwind blockchain obfuscation. I felt both triumphant and helpless. The sight of the boss in the headlines felt different now, less invulnerable and more dangerous, like a trapped animal. The next twist arrived when a key witness vanished from his home without warning. The missing witness turned the case cold for a week. Search parties and police found nothing. Rumors swirled that he had fled. Mara suspected foul play. We pushed harder, and the pressure forced a break. A courier found a burned hard drive in a trash pile behind a diner. The drive, when partially recovered, contained drafts of emails that showed the boss's nickname again. The recovered text included a line, "Contingency greenlit. Execute at 1:13. It was crude but damning. The missing witness reappeared days later at a bus station, dazed and frightened. He would later say he had been threatened and told to leave, that his family would be safer if he disappeared. He returned because he could not live with the guilt. His testimony was shaky, but it added human color to dry numbers. As he told his story, faces in the room shifted. I watched the boss from across the table and saw his jaw tighten. He had the look of someone who thought they could buy time forever. The path of justice felt slow, like snow melting, but with each testimony the ground softened. Public anger grew into action. Demonstrations called for accountability. Investors filed class actions. The company announced an independent audit and then delayed it. The boss tried to rally loyalists, but many left him. The missing money's echo reached small businesses and employees who lost bonuses. Their voices joined ours. The sense of rightness that had pushed me forward spread like fire. Then the boss made a bold play. He tried to settle quietly with a payment to affected parties in exchange for silence. The offer was huge, but it came with gag orders and no criminal admission. Mara refused. "Justice isn't a payment plan," she said. The public scorn grew. A new twist came when internal chat logs surfaced that showed the boss mocking employees who raised alarms. The logs painted him as callous. He looked good on camera, but the truth in the text was small and brutal. The crowd outside the headquarters chanted his name turned sour. Somewhere, small acts of courage and protest pushed the case forward. I felt that the world had shifted, that our determination had broken a spell of invulnerability. As the legal fight intensified, my life became a blur of hearings and interviews. I found occasional moments of calm when I walked alone at night and thought of nothing but sky. The boss's defenses thinned. One board member turned state's witness and supplied documents linking payments to a trust controlled by the boss's cousin. The cousin was evasive at first, then flipped when faced with exposure. The cousin's testimony was messy but useful. It revealed phone records and wire transfers that led to a bank in another country. International cooperation moved slowly, but it moved. The company attempted a final gambit, claimed that a sophisticated hacker had framed them by planting files. For a moment, that defense gained traction with people who wanted a neat villain outside. Mara shot back with evidence of coordinated removals of logs and personal approvals. The boss's public image cracked further. People I had once worked beside began to call me to offer quiet apologies and small cards that said, "I knew." The human cost of silence became visible. I felt both vindicated and exhausted. Then, in the middle of a hearing, a new name appeared in an email chain that changed everything. The email chain included a consultant hired quietly months before the transfer. He had access to the systems and a pleasant LinkedIn profile. The chain included instructions to deploy a cleaner on a specific date. The consultant's name had not surfaced before. Mara called him a ghost. We traced payments to a small firm offshore that dissolved within days of the transfer. The consultant turned out to be real and terrified. He agreed to meet in secret and tell us his story. He said he had been hired to test resilience and was given scripts that looked like legitimate audits. Later he realized the scripts were designed to erase logs. He tried to refuse, but threats to his family forced him to comply. His voice shook as he described the moment he watched numbers shift. His testimony provided a direct link between the boss's instructions and the technical execution. The room where he told the story felt small, and the air heavy. The boss denied involvement, but the consultant's account was specific and painful. Trust began to crumble. The next twist came when the boss tried to flee the country. The boss's passport was flagged, and he was detained at the airport. Cameras swarmed. For a bright, dizzy hour, the man who had pushed me aside was surrounded by questions. He looked smaller in custody, like someone whose world had been carved away. The press circled, hungry for a single dramatic confession. He refused to speak beyond rehearsed lines. The international bank froze several accounts. The sensory rush of seeing him in trouble was complicated by the knowledge that money might still slip through lies and legal loops. The hearing was tense. The boss's legal team tried to bargain, paint him as a scapegoat, and claim systemic failures rather than plotted fraud. The courtroom felt theatrical. The missing sums had ripple effects. Charities flagged donations tied to shell companies, properties were placed under temporary restraining orders, and the public outrage turned into real, legal consequences. I sat in the gallery and felt the weight of everything that had happened to me. I had been shoved aside, but I had pushed back until the world looked at the men who once seemed untouchable. Yet even as the boss sat in a holding room, the full amount of $2.1 billion had not been recovered. A breakthrough came when a small portion of funds was traced to investments in a tech startup. The startup had been a facade, a pet project that never developed a product. Its owner was a young entrepreneur with big ideas and little oversight. He claimed ignorance. But bank records and emails showed he had been courted by people who promised growth and funding. The startup had funneled cash into consultants, shell companies, and then back into private accounts. The trail grew cleaner as investigators followed it. The $2.1 billion had been sliced and moved through many hands. We recovered fragments, enough to fuel legal claims and public fury but not enough to undo the harm. The boss's defense frayed as victims testified about lost pensions, deferred bonuses, and broken trust. The court ordered emergency restitution funds assembled from frozen assets. It felt like a small victory. The narrative shifted from a single theft to a pattern of organized greed. Yet a final twist remained. A hidden ledger that could show the boss's personal gain in cold numbers still lay in a place we had not found. The hunt for that ledger became an obsession. The ledger was whispered about like a myth. Insiders called it the book. I learned it might be hidden in a legal filing with a trust company under a false name. Mara worked with international counsel to subpoena records. Days became a blur of calls in different time zones. Just when we feared another dead end, a clerk in a small financial office in a coastal city found a misfiled packet. Inside was a copied ledger, dusty and stamped with dates. It listed transfers, beneficiaries, and a code that matched the boss's private nickname. Proof at last. The ledger showed how money moved from the executive reserve into trusts and then into investments that benefited a close circle. The entries were dull and precise, which made them more damning. With the ledger, prosecutors had a clear path. Arrests followed. The boss faced charges, and his cronies were swept up in a wave of indictments. The public felt vindicated. For me, the ledger meant something personal, a record that proved the betrayal I had felt in my bones. I stared at the pages until the ink blurred, because those numbers were the truth of what had happened to my years of work. The trial began with dry legalese and then swelled into human stories. Victims told how the loss of funds affected their lives. A teacher who had lost retirement funds cried quietly. A small business owner described how withheld investments closed a door on expansion. The boss sat pale and still, watching the world he had curated crumble. Evidence included the ledger, the whistleblower tapes, and the consultant's testimony. Each piece fit together with a clarity that made my chest ache. The defense fought back with technicalities, but the jury listened to the faces in the room. The trial gave names to abstract loss. I found myself testifying about the culture that had ignored warnings and rewarded silence. Speaking felt like pulling teeth and also like healing. The boss's face changed as testimonies mounted. He seemed less like an enemy and more like a man who had made corrosive choices. When the jury returned guilty on multiple counts, the room released a collective breath. The victory was real but bittersweet. Money could not erase years lost, but accountability mattered. Sentencing followed, and the boss received years behind bars. The court ordered restitution and heavy fines for the company. Several executives faced prison time. Some funds were recovered and used to create a restitution fund for victims. The company restructured and promised reforms. Public trust had been broken, but the people who had pushed for truth felt a slow peace. For me, life shifted. I testified in hearings, spoke to regulators about reform, and helped create protocols to prevent similar thefts. Even small changes felt like victories. Yet, the emotional wound of being tossed aside took longer to heal. Friends who had not spoken now offered apologies and awkward hugs. I found that forgiveness was not a single act but a slow series of days when anger cooled into clarity. I kept the black card with 3 numbers and placed it in a drawer. The world had turned, but the memory of that first morning remained bright. A final twist came from an unexpected ally, the young entrepreneur who had run the faux startup. He reached out from a rehab program where he had entered after the fraud surfaced. He told me he had been dazzled and used. His confession led to additional leads that helped recover more funds. He asked for leniency in his sentence in exchange for cooperation. The court considered his plea. He showed genuine remorse, and that made his testimony unusual and useful. We recovered another small portion of the funds and found documents showing how the boss had recruited people with charm and promises. The entrepreneur's story reminded me that greed corrupts everyone it touches, even those who think they are only following orders. It felt like a small redemption story. People changed. Policies changed. I changed. I quit the kind of work I had done and started advising non-profits about financial safeguards. Each day I felt the loss and also the purpose born of that loss. Years later, the amount returned never matched the full $2.1 billion, but enough came back to restore many lives and bring some justice. I stood at a small ceremony where a plaque honored transparency and whistleblowers. I read names aloud and felt tears come. The boss watched from behind glass, his face older, hardened by time. I forgave him in a private way, not for him, but so I could live. My story had become many stories, of victims, of brave witnesses, of a lawyer who would not be bought, of a journalist who risked everything. The final twist was that what started as my personal loss grew into a movement for accountability. People changed laws, created new checks, and made promises into actions. I kept my old notebooks, the burned drive fragments, and the photo on my wall as reminders. The night I left my old office, I felt like a coin tossed aside. Years later, I felt like a key that opened a lock many thought permanent. My name is Sasha. I lost a place, a title, and trust. I found courage, allies, and a way to turn hurt into change. I watched billions disappear and then, through stubborn truth, watched justice grow. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and tap the bell to get notified the moment we drop a new story, and don't forget to like the video to help others find it.